One of our goals with resource management inside of vSphere is to help make sure that one VM, for example, this bad boy right here, to make sure that it doesn't monopolize some resource that's used by other VMs as well. So let's imagine that this VM is using iSCSI2, specifically the data store named iSCSI2, as the home for this VM's files. If this VM is doing thousands and thousands of IOs to and from its disk, which is being stored on this data store, that could negatively impact another VM who's also using that data store. So in an earlier nugget, we took a look at storage DRS. And with storage DRS, if we identify that one of our data stores is really getting hammered, it could move one or more VM's data files off of that data store to a less busy data store. And behind the scenes, it's important to understand how the ESXi host knows that that data store is being hammered. And the answer is storage I/O control is enabled on this data store. And with storage I/O control enabled regarding a specific data store, the ESXi host using that data store starts monitoring the latency in communicating with that data store. And if the host exceeds the threshold, it can start to realize, oh no, there's a problem. There is just not enough I/O to go around to make everybody happy. And at that point, we'd have contention regarding access to their virtual hard drives and such on that data store. And very similar to how we handle the contention with RAM and CPU, we also can handle the contention regarding which VMs get how many IOs to a data store by using the concept of shares. And these would be shares as they relate to the hard drive used by a specific VM. So there's a few requirements that we need to be aware of regarding storage I/O control. Number one, if we have a data store with multiple extents, like iSCSI1 does, it's using a couple of different LUNs, we cannot use storage I/O control on a data store that has multiple extents that make up that data store. However, iSCSI2, that data store, does not have multiple extents, and as a result, we could enable it on this data store, iSCSI2. Also, if we have multiple vCenters that are managing a data store, that would prevent us also from enabling storage I/O control on that data store. So we need to have a data store under the control of a single vCenter server. We'd also have to have the appropriate license to use the feature of storage I/O control, which is Enterprise Plus. And this feature has been around for a while, but if we have a really old host, for example running ES6i version 4.x, and that older version does not support storage I/O control, of course we couldn't use that feature unless each of our hosts associated with that data store can support the feature, which would be version 5 of the ES6i hosts and above. So here in the vSphere web client, logged on as administrator at nuggetlab.com, let's go first enable the feature of storage I/O control on a data store. So to do that, we can go ahead and click on the Storage tab here in the Navigator pane. And let's right-click on iSCSI2. And because iSCSI2 does not have multiple extents, let's go ahead and select from the menu, Configure Storage I/O Control. And from here, we'll put a check in the checkbox to enable Storage I/O Control. And with that enabled, we'll go ahead and use the default threshold and click on OK. So if we were to click on iSCSI2 and click on the Monitor tab, and then click on Tasks and Events, if we click on Tasks, it shows us that the Storage I/O control was enabled on that data store. And if we click on Configure and then select General, right here it's also showing us that Storage I/O control is enabled. And what that does, it causes the ES6i hosts who are using this data store to start paying attention to the latency. And then if there's a contention situation where the threshold is crossed, it can start divvying up the IOs based on the actual shares associated with each of the VMs. So let's take a look at the VMs that are currently using this data store. If we click on iSCSI2 on the left here, and we click on the VMs tab, regarding that data store, currently we have two VMs that are using that data store, the small VM and VM5. So let's take a look at a VM level of the shares associated with the disk drive for a VM. So if we right-click, for example, on small VM, from the drop-down we have this option of Edit Resource Settings, which is great for limits and reservations and shares for CPU and memory, but it does not include the shares regarding the hard drive, which are associated with storage I/O control. To modify those shares for the hard drive, we'd click on Edit Settings for the VM, and from here we could expand the hard disk. So here we have a West Coast storage policy that we applied earlier, and then right here we have shares. So the default shares for storage I/O are 1000, and that's for normal. If we set it to high for the VM, that'd be 2000. If we set it to low, that would be 500, or we can specify custom and put in a number of our choice. So that way, If we had two VMs and we wanted to give the highest priority for storage I/O to one VM, we simply give that VM higher number of shares, and then in a contention situation, that machine with the larger shares would get a larger portion of the I/Os regarding storage. So I'm going to go ahead and specify this back at normal. We could also specify here a limit if we want to make sure that no more than a certain number of I/Os per second were able to be accomplished by this VM. So if we made changes, we click on OK to save those changes. And it's also showing us those shares right here as well on the VMs tab. And with the data store still selected here on the left, we could click on Monitor. And then from the sub button here, select Performance. And then from the View drop-down, we could go ahead and specify Performance once again. And then for the time range, let's specify Real Time. And then to bring it up, we can go ahead and click inside this box to reveal the information regarding storage I/O control and latency. And as we scroll down, we have multiple graphs that we can select. And in our virtualized environment, I would expect incredibly high latency because we're virtualizing everything. So in this nugget, we identified that storage I/O control can help us in a contention situation by dishing out the available I/O to a data store based on the shares allocated with a virtual machine. And so what I invite you to do is practice what we've done in this nugget in the hands-on lab provided, and I'll see you in the next video. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.